She had my name, my social security number, my credit score. For 2 years, she used every piece of who I was to build a life, while mine quietly fell apart behind her back. Her name was Danielle Carter, and she was not a stranger hiding behind a computer screen somewhere overseas. She was my best friend of 15 years, the woman who knew my coffee order, my childhood nickname, and the code to my garage door. She was the one I called first when my father passed away, and the one I trusted with my house key when I traveled. Somewhere in the middle of all that closeness, she stopped being my best friend and quietly became me instead. This is the story of how I found out, and how karma eventually came looking for her, whether she was ready for it or not. For most of my adult life, if you had asked me to name one person I trusted completely, without a single doubt, I would have said Danielle Carter without pausing to think about it. What I am about to tell you is not a story about a stranger who hacked into a database somewhere and stole a set of numbers. It is a story about a woman who was invited into my home, my finances, and my family, and who used every ounce of that access with a patience that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it now. By the time I understood what had truly happened, there were credit cards I never opened, a car loan I never signed for, and a stranger's version of my own name attached to debts I could not explain to a bank representative who did not believe a word I was saying. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Picture an ordinary Tuesday morning, because that is exactly how it began for me. No dramatic warning, no gut feeling, nothing that felt out of place. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside my laptop when a phone call came in from a number I didn't recognize. A debt collection agency asking about a credit card account that had my name, my birth date, and my old apartment address on it. I told the woman on the phone she had the wrong person. She read my social security number back to me, one digit at a time, and I felt the floor tilt slightly under my chair. What followed over the next several weeks was a slow, disorienting unraveling of everything I thought I understood about my own financial life. A mortgage refinance suddenly fell through over discrepancies no loan officer could explain to me. A routine credit check for a new job revealed accounts I had never heard of, opened in cities I had never lived in. The most difficult part was not the paperwork or the hours spent on hold. It was the creeping question that started forming late at night, one I tried to talk myself out of asking. Whoever had done this knew details a stranger simply could not have known. My mother's maiden name, the name of my first pet. Facts you could only know if you had sat across from me at my own kitchen table and asked, the way a best friend does, simply because she cared. I did not want to believe what that meant. For weeks I built other explanations, each one more comfortable than the truth waiting underneath them. Maybe it was an old ex-boyfriend with a grudge. Maybe it was a data breach. I clung to every version of this story that did not require me to look at the woman who had stood beside me at my own wedding and ask myself whether she was capable of doing this to me on purpose, for years, while smiling at me across a dinner table. What I did not know yet, sitting there with a stack of unfamiliar statements in front of me, was how deep this actually went, or how far Danielle Carter was willing to go to keep her secret buried once I started asking questions she was not prepared to answer. All I knew was that the life I thought I understood had a crack running straight through the middle of it, and it was about to split wide open, and that whoever was on the other side of it had known me far too well for far too long to be a stranger. There are 3 questions that followed me through the months that came after that phone call, questions I suspect will follow you too by the time this story ends. How does a person build an entire second financial identity out of someone they claim to love, without leaving behind a single visible crack for 2 full years? What does it take to convince yourself that stealing from your closest friend is not only possible, but justified? And when the truth finally surfaces, when there is no more room left to explain any of it away, what does real consequence actually look like for someone who spent that long hiding behind a smile at your own dinner table? I did not have those answers yet either, not for a long time. What I can tell you now is that piecing this story together required me to look back at 15 years of memories I thought I understood completely, and to notice, for the first time, small moments I had once dismissed without a second thought. None of it seemed like evidence back then. All of it became evidence eventually, and once you know how to look for a pattern like that, you cannot unsee it. To understand how something like this happens, you have to go back much further than that kitchen table, back before the debt collector's call, back before I ever had a single reason to doubt her. You have to start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly who Danielle Carter was to me, and exactly how much of my life I had already handed her, one trusting year at a time. I met Danielle Carter in the fall I turned 23, in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of Columbus, Ohio. I had just finished nursing school and was working my first job on a hospital floor, and Danielle was living 2 doors down, working double shifts at a salon while saving to open a bakery she talked about with more excitement than anything else in her life. We became friends almost by accident, and within 6 months we were closer than most people become with family they have known their entire lives. She was funny, sharp, and remembered small details about people that most of us forget within minutes. She sat beside me for 6 hours the night my father was rushed to the hospital, holding my hand when the doctor finally came out to speak with us. Our lives moved in different directions over the years, but the friendship never weakened. She was the first person I called after I met Mark, and she stood beside me at our wedding, crying harder than my own mother, giving a toast that still makes me emotional to think about now, knowing everything I know today. Danielle's own path was rockier. Her bakery, Sweetly Danielle's, opened when she was 29 and struggled under debt she never fully explained to me. At 33, she was engaged to a man named Trevor, a relationship that ended abruptly and painfully when he left her responsible for a car loan and a credit card balance in both their names. I let her stay in my guest room for 3 months that year and eventually co-signed a small loan to help her get back on her feet. Looking back, I can now identify when the tone of our friendship began to shift, though I could not have named it then. Danielle started asking more specific questions about my finances, framed as casual curiosity, how much Mark and I had saved, whether we had considered refinancing, what bank we used. She once asked, almost in passing, whether I still kept my Social Security card in the fireproof box in my home office, a question I answered honestly, because why would I ever suspect the woman who cried at my wedding of memorizing where I kept my most sensitive paperwork? Over the years, the small acts of generosity between us went almost entirely in one direction, though I never once thought of it that way at the time. I babysat for no one because Danielle had no children of her own, but she watched mine constantly, without being asked, whenever Mark and I needed a night out or a weekend away. In return, I lent her money more times than I could count, small amounts at first, then larger ones once the bakery struggled, always paid back eventually, always accompanied by a card or a gift that made the debt feel more like generosity between sisters than an actual loan. I shared the password to our family streaming accounts with her, our home Wi-Fi network, even a spare key to our house for the years she lived nearby, none of it feeling like risk at the time, all of it feeling like exactly what a real friendship should look like. The true beginning of everything, I now understand, came during my father's final illness, when Danielle offered to help me organize his estate paperwork while I split my time between the hospital and my own children. She sat at my kitchen table for hours those evenings, sorting through folders that included copies of my identification and financial records, and I thanked her constantly for being exactly the friend I needed, never imagining she was quietly memorizing the details that would eventually cost me everything. Looking back, I remember one particular evening when she asked, almost too casually, whether the fireproof box also held my birth certificate and old tax returns, a question that felt entirely reasonable in the moment, buried as it was inside an hour of genuine, exhausting grief. I want to be fair to those years, because I think it matters for understanding what came later. Danielle was not simply performing friendship this entire time. She showed up for my children's school events when Mark was traveling for work. She drove 3 hours to sit with me after a miscarriage I had never told anyone else about, arriving with soup and a blanket, and no expectation of conversation if I did not want one. I say this because I think the truest, most painful version of this story is not one where every single moment was calculated from day one. It is one where genuine love and eventual betrayal existed inside the same person, at the same time, in a way I am still not sure I will ever fully understand. By the time my father passed away, Danielle had become someone I described to other people as family, rather than simply a friend. She spoke at his small memorial service, sharing a story about how he used to call her his second daughter, a title she seemed to treasure every time it was mentioned. Nobody in that room, least of all me, could have imagined that the woman standing at the podium honoring my father's memory was already by that point sitting on copies of documents she would soon use to quietly dismantle the life he had spent decades helping me build. I have replayed that memorial service in my mind more times than any other single day from this entire story, searching her voice for some crack in the sincerity, and never once finding one. I have wondered often where the seeds of this actually took root, long before either of us ever met. Danielle spoke occasionally about a childhood marked by financial instability, a father who moved in and out of steady work, a household where money was a source of quiet humiliation rather than simple practicality. I do not share this to excuse anything she eventually did, because plenty of people carry difficult histories without ever choosing to harm someone they love. I share it because a forensic psychologist I later consulted suggested that early experiences of financial shame can, in some people, calcify over time into a distorted belief that taking from someone more stable is a form of justice rather than harm, especially when that stability feels, unfairly or not, like something simply handed over without effort. The psychologist told me something else during that conversation that reshaped how I thought about the entire situation. She explained that people capable of sustained deception like this often develop what she called compartmentalization at an unusually advanced level, a process that allows someone to maintain two seemingly contradictory realities at once, without the internal conflict most of us would assume must be present. In practical terms, this meant Danielle's affection for me, the tears at my wedding, the comfort during my father's illness, could have been entirely genuine in the moment, while an entirely separate part of her mind was simultaneously planning a scheme that directly harmed me, with remarkably little bleed between the two. She also told me, gently but directly, that people like Danielle often become skilled, sometimes without fully realizing it, at selecting targets who share a particular combination of traits: genuine trust, emotional generosity, and a strong reluctance to believe the worst about people they love. She said these were not flaws in my character. They were some of my most admirable qualities, simply exploited by someone who understood exactly how to use them against me. I have carried that reframing with me ever since, on the days when shame threatens to creep back in and convince me I should have known better all along. It rarely fully quiets that voice, but it gives me something honest to answer it with, something rooted in expertise rather than my own exhausted, circular self-doubt at 2 a.m. What I am about to describe, I only pieced together later, from bank records and Danielle's own eventual admissions. According to the timeline investigators reconstructed, the first fraudulent account, a modest department store credit card, was opened only 6 weeks after those evenings sorting my father's paperwork, using my name, my social security number, and an old address only someone who had gone looking for it would know. For months, the charges stayed small and unremarkable, nothing that would trigger an alert. This was not panic or desperation acted on impulsively. This was patience, deliberate and controlled. During this same period, Danielle and I were seeing each other more than ever, not less. We took a family trip to a lake house that summer, and I have looked at photographs from that weekend more times than I can count, since learning the truth, searching her face for some sign of what she was already doing to me. I have never found one. 8 months in, according to loan documents that surfaced later, She used my identity to finance a used car from a dealership 40 minutes away, far enough that the paperwork was unlikely to cross paths with anyone who knew either of us. Around the same time, she told me over coffee that she was relaunching a smaller version of her bakery from home, and I offered to help spread the word, never suspecting the industrial equipment she needed was being financed through a business loan that carried my name and my credit history instead of her own. The piece of this timeline hardest for me to accept involves an apartment lease signed 14 months in. Danielle needed a larger space, and rather than apply under her own damaged credit, she submitted a rental application using my identity and a fabricated employment letter routing back to a prepaid phone. There were small things during this period that felt slightly off: a new phone number, a growing vagueness about her schedule, moments I dismissed almost as quickly as I noticed them, because questioning them meant doubting 15 years of trust I was not ready to give up. I remember one dinner, roughly a year and a half into all of it, when Danielle showed up wearing a coat I did not recognize, expensive-looking in a way that did not match the version of her finances she had described to me only weeks earlier. She explained it as a gift from a client at the salon, and I complimented it and moved on, the way you do with a friend you have known for 15 years, never once connecting it to anything more complicated than good luck finally coming her way. What I did not know, and would only learn much later from the forensic accountant's report, was that by this point, Danielle was managing 14 separate accounts simultaneously, tracking due dates and minimum payments across a rotating structure designed specifically to avoid triggering any single alert large enough to draw attention. It required a kind of sustained organization that still unsettles me to think about now, a discipline she apparently applied to deceiving me with far more consistency than she had ever applied to her own bakery's finances. That debt collector's call, the one that started this story, came almost exactly 2 years after the first fraudulent account was opened. For 24 months, an entire second version of my financial life had existed quietly alongside my real one, and I never saw it coming. There was one moment during this period that I did not learn about until much later, one that still makes me feel physically ill when I think about it too directly. 16 months in, Danielle used the fraudulent business loan funds to make a payment on the guest room furniture in her own new apartment, the very apartment leased under my name, and posted a photograph of that furniture online with a caption thanking, without naming anyone specifically, the people who had helped make her fresh start possible. At the time, scrolling past that photo on my phone, I liked it without a second thought and left a comment telling her how proud of her I was. I did not know I was congratulating myself, in a sense, for financing my own betrayal. Roughly 20 months in, according to the loan documents that would later surface, Danielle used my identity to secure business financing for the bakery equipment relaunch, structured deliberately through a small lender that required less rigorous verification, calibrated just below the threshold that typically triggers closer scrutiny. This was not a woman acting out of blind panic. This was someone who had clearly done her homework, who understood exactly how far she could push each application before risking discovery, and who had, by this point, built an entire second financial identity with a level of discipline I still find difficult to reconcile with the person who once cried at my wedding. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for anyone watching who has ever wondered how a person misses signs like these for so long. There were moments during this period when small things felt slightly off to me, moments I dismissed almost as quickly as I noticed them. Danielle grew slightly more private about her day-to-day schedule, less specific than she used to be about where exactly she was living or working on a given week. None of it seemed significant enough to question directly, because questioning it directly would have meant doubting a person I had built 15 years of trust around, and I was not ready to do that yet, not even a little. I think that reluctance, more than any single piece of evidence I missed, is the part of this story I have had to work hardest to forgive myself for. I remember one dinner during this same window when Danielle mentioned, almost in passing, that she had started using a new phone number, explaining it away as an issue with her old carrier. I nodded. refilled her wine glass, and asked about her week instead, the way you do with someone you have loved for 15 years and have no reason on earth to doubt. It is strange now, looking back, to realize how many separate small doors I unknowingly held open for her during that dinner alone, each one so minor on its own that closing it would have felt paranoid, even cruel, to a friendship built on the assumption of complete good faith. I think that is the part of sustained betrayal people rarely talk about, how ordinary and unremarkable each individual moment feels while it is actually happening to you. It is only afterward, once you have the full picture laid out in front of you, like a completed puzzle, that the individual pieces suddenly look as obvious as they were always going to look in hindsight. The days after that call passed in a blur of hold music and frustrated phone calls. I pulled my full credit report and counted 11 accounts I did not recognize. My first instinct was to search for any explanation that did not require me to suspect someone I loved. I thought of a data breach my hospital employer had disclosed years earlier and clung to that theory until compliance confirmed the accounts included details, like my mother's maiden name, that breach never exposed. My mind went next to Trevor, and I actually called Danielle in tears to warn her that her ex might be more dangerous than either of us realized. She comforted me for over an hour, offering to help me track him down, playing the role of concerned best friend so convincingly that I believed we were solving this together, rather than sitting across from the person responsible for all of it. I want you to sit with the discomfort of that phone call for a moment, because it is one of the details that still haunts me the most. I called the woman stealing from me, crying, asking for her help, and she comforted me so completely that I thanked her afterward for being exactly the kind of friend I needed during a frightening time. A private investigator eventually confirmed Trevor had been living out of state the entire time, and the list of people who had both my information and the opportunity to use it had grown very short. A package arrived at my house by mistake, addressed to a name I didn't recognize, listing a middle name that matched my mother's maiden name, a detail I had only ever shared with Danielle. I sat with that package in my hands for nearly 20 minutes before opening it, and inside was a set of custom cake decorating tools shipped to an apartment complex less than 15 minutes from Danielle's home. I did not confront her immediately. Instead, I hired a forensic accountant recommended by my attorney, a quiet, methodical woman who spent nearly 3 weeks tracing every fraudulent application back to its source, cross-referencing shipping addresses, phone numbers, and the IP addresses used to submit forms online. What she found, laid out across a conference table in a folder thicker than I expected, was a pattern too specific to be coincidence. Multiple applications submitted from Danielle's home internet address, a rental form listing her own cell number as a secondary contact, an error someone clearly meant to catch and correct but never did. I remember sitting with that folder in my lap for nearly an hour before I could bring myself to read it a second time, still hoping, foolishly, that a more innocent explanation might reveal itself somewhere between the pages. It did not. Every page only confirmed what the first one had already told me, in slightly different language, from a slightly different angle, as if the truth itself needed to say the same thing several times before I would finally let myself hear it. I confronted her first on a Thursday evening in my kitchen, the same table where she had once sorted through my father's paperwork with such apparent care. I laid the folder between us and asked her directly whether she had opened any accounts using my information. She denied everything, gently at first and then with more edge, suggesting stress over my father's death was making me see connections that weren't there, that it hurt her deeply to be accused this way after everything we had built together. I left that conversation doubting myself more than I doubted her, questioning whether grief really had clouded my judgment, until Mark asked me quietly whether any other person alive fit every single piece of that forensic report. I could not name one. Not one single other person on earth fit every piece of the pattern the way Danielle did, and saying that sentence out loud to my own husband, in my own kitchen, was the moment I finally stopped looking for another explanation. Filing the police report was one of the hardest calls I have ever made, Not because I doubted the evidence any longer, but because some part of me still felt like I was betraying her by making it official, a strange, backward loyalty that took me a long time to fully let go of. Detective Sarah Combs walked me through the FTC affidavit and credit freezes with a patience I will always be grateful for, and told me something I have never forgotten, that in cases like mine, involving someone deeply trusted rather than a stranger, the betrayal itself is often what delays justice, because victims spend so much time protecting the person responsible before they finally protect themselves. My first instinct, and I think this is true for most people in this situation, was to search for any explanation that did not require me to suspect someone I loved. I thought immediately of a security breach my hospital employer had disclosed years earlier, and convinced myself for nearly a week that this must be the source, some criminal ring buying stolen data off a hidden corner of the internet and using it against thousands of victims like me. The compliance office eventually confirmed the accounts opened in my name included details, like my mother's maiden name and my childhood pet's name used as security answers, that had never been part of any database the hackers accessed. That confirmation should have pointed me immediately toward the truth, but instead, my mind went somewhere else entirely, toward Trevor, a man I had never fully trusted, who had access to Danielle's apartment during the exact years she and I had spent so much time together at my house. Detective Combs advised me not to change my behavior too dramatically during those months, worried that tipping Danielle off before evidence collection was complete might give her time to destroy records or disappear with whatever money remained. So I did something that still feels strange to describe. I kept showing up. I sat across from her at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend only 3 weeks before her arrest, passing the bread, laughing at a joke she made, carrying the full weight of a forensic report in my mind, while she had no idea her own kitchen table conversation with me 2 years earlier was about to become the centerpiece of a criminal case against her. The investigation took 4 months in total, months I spent maintaining that fragile normalcy while detectives quietly built a case in the background, months that tested my patience more than almost anything else in this entire story, since every fiber of me wanted immediate answers, and Detective Combs kept reminding me, gently but firmly, that patience was the only thing standing between a real conviction and a case that could collapse entirely if Danielle had time to notice and react. The final confrontation came after a search warrant on her apartment recovered printed copies of my identification, handwritten notes containing my financial account numbers, and a small notebook that appeared to track which fraudulent accounts were open, closed, or still active, a color-coded system of dates and abbreviated references that must have required real, sustained mental effort to maintain across 2 full years without a single documented lapse. When I told her, recording the conversation at the detective's request, her denial finally collapsed into something colder than the warmth I had known for 15 years. She told me it had started small, during real desperation after Trevor left her drowning in debt, and that some part of her had convinced herself it had always felt easy for me, my marriage, my stability, and that she deserved to borrow a piece of that ease, even if borrowing meant taking it without asking. The fallout among our shared circle of friends and family happened quickly once the report became public. Some people took her side at first, certain there had to be a misunderstanding. My own mother, who had known Danielle since we were in our 20s, cried on the phone and asked me a question I have never fully been able to answer since. How do you spend 15 years loving someone who was quietly building a case against your entire life the whole time? Mark carried a particular kind of burden throughout this process that I did not fully appreciate until much later, torn between wanting to protect me from additional pain and needing to have honest conversations about decisions that affected our entire family. There were nights I would find him still awake long after I had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with our financial documents spread in front of him, quietly calculating exactly how deep the damage went and how long recovery might take. He never once made me feel responsible for what had happened, though I know now the stress of that period affected him far more than he let on to me at the time. My children were young enough that I made a deliberate choice to shield them from most of the details, though my oldest eventually asked me directly why Miss Danielle no longer came to birthday parties or holiday dinners, a question that forced me to find language simple enough for a child to understand without frightening her. I told her that sometimes people we love very much make choices that break trust so badly the relationship cannot continue the way it used to, even when we still care about them in some way. She asked me if that meant she should be afraid of her other friends, and I told her no, that most people never do something like this, but that it is always okay to pay attention when something feels wrong, even with people we love. Danielle was arrested 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, on charges of identity theft, fraud, and forgery, each carrying its own set of potential penalties under Ohio law. Detective Combs called me personally to let me know before it happened, a courtesy that made the entire situation feel suddenly, terrifyingly real in a way that paperwork and phone calls never had. The final numbers, once fully itemized by the prosecutor's office, were worse than I expected. $87,000 in fraudulent debt across 14 accounts, built over 2 full years on the foundation of a friendship I trusted without question. During discovery, investigators found something none of us anticipated, evidence of a smaller, earlier pattern involving a former roommate named Kristen, who had discovered unauthorized charges years before I ever met Danielle and quietly paid them off herself rather than risk the friendship. This was not one desperate season of bad judgment. It was a method Danielle had already tested and refined on someone else, long before I ever became her target. Detective Combs arranged for me to speak with Kristen directly, two strangers connected only by a shared experience neither of us ever expected to have in common. Kristen told me she had noticed unauthorized charges years earlier, confronted Danielle, and received the exact same calm denial I would later receive myself, before ultimately paying the debt quietly and letting the friendship fade, rather than risk destroying it, over something she worried might turn out to be a misunderstanding. Hearing her story filled in a gap I had not realized existed. This was not a woman who fell into desperation once. This was a method, tested and refined for over a decade before I ever became her target. Kristen cried during our phone call, apologizing for not having said something sooner, worried that her own silence years earlier had allowed this pattern to continue. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I understood completely why she made that choice, because I had nearly made the same one myself, more than once during my own experience. She eventually agreed to provide a statement to prosecutors, and Judge Wentworth referenced it directly during sentencing, noting that a pattern spanning more than a decade demonstrated something categorically different from an isolated lapse in judgment. Learning about Kristen changed something fundamental in how I understood everything that had happened to me. This was not a single lapse in judgment, born from one desperate season of Danielle's life, a story I might have eventually found some sliver of sympathy for, despite the damage it caused. This was a method she had developed and refined over the better part of a decade, one relationship at a time, always with someone close enough to trust her completely, always someone who would hesitate before believing the worst. I sat with Detective Combs the day this information came to light, and I remember asking her directly whether she believed I had simply been the latest chapter in a story that had already happened before. She told me, carefully but honestly, that the evidence certainly suggested that possibility, and that in her years handling cases like mine, patterns spanning multiple victims and multiple years were unfortunately more common than most people would ever assume, precisely because they so rarely got reported the first time around. The arraignment took place in a courtroom smaller and less dramatic than I imagined, fluorescent lighting overhead, rows of uncomfortable wooden benches. Danielle appeared in a plain gray suit her mother had brought for her, standing beside a public defender who spoke in clipped, procedural language that made everything sound smaller than it actually felt sitting in the gallery watching it unfold. She did not look at me once, though I found myself unable to stop looking at her, searching for some final trace of the woman who had held my hand in a hospital hallway when I was 26 years old. Her mother approached me in the hallway during a recess, eyes red and swollen, apologizing through tears, telling me she loved me like a second daughter and felt as betrayed as I did, in her own way. The plea negotiations stretched 5 months, the prosecutor arguing that the sustained duration of the fraud, combined with the pattern involving Kristen, demonstrated calculated intent rather than a single moment of crisis. I gave a victim impact statement I spent nearly 3 weeks writing and rewriting, unable to find language that felt adequate for what I actually wanted the court to understand. My voice shook through most of it, and I paused at one point, unable to continue for nearly 30 seconds, while the entire courtroom waited in silence. I told the judge the hardest part was not rebuilding my credit, difficult as that process had been, but learning to question my own judgment about every close relationship in my life, wondering what other warning signs I might be missing in people I loved, simply because I could not imagine them capable of causing me harm. Danielle's own statement was shorter than I expected. She apologized, said desperation had made her capable of things she never believed she would do, and never once mentioned Kristen at all. Prosecutor Alvarez told me privately afterward that in her experience, the victims who recovered most fully were rarely the ones who received a complete, satisfying explanation for why the betrayal happened. They were the ones who eventually stopped waiting for that explanation before allowing themselves to move forward. Judge Patricia Wentworth spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the case before announcing her decision, telling Danielle directly that friendship, built on genuine trust, was one of the more valuable things a person could be given, and that using it as a tool of deception represented a violation the court could not treat lightly, regardless of whatever hardship had originally motivated it. She sentenced Danielle to 18 months of incarceration, 3 years of probation, and full restitution of the $87,000 she had stolen. Part of me expected to feel a sense of triumph hearing those numbers read aloud, some satisfying sense that justice had finally arrived to balance the scales. What I actually felt, sitting in that gallery, was something far more complicated, a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a grief I had not fully anticipated, grief for a friendship that had once meant more to me than almost anything else in my life. What struck me most, learning it only after sentencing, was how the scheme actually unraveled. It was not some dramatic mistake born from arrogance. It was a single, overlooked detail, a phone number accidentally left as her own on one rental application, buried among otherwise carefully falsified documents, the exact kind of small oversight she herself had once teased me about years earlier when I forgot to update a billing address. The carelessness she used to gently mock in me became the thread that unraveled everything she had built. Rebuilding took nearly 2 years of exhausting, methodical effort, disputing fraudulent accounts one at a time across all 3 bureaus, providing notarized affidavits and police report numbers for each creditor who demanded proof before agreeing to remove the debt. There were setbacks that tested my patience more than I expected. Creditors who lost paperwork and required resubmission, a mortgage lender who remained hesitant to approve us for refinancing even 18 months after the fraudulent accounts had officially been cleared. I started seeing a therapist roughly 6 months after sentencing, someone who introduced me to a grief with no name I had ever heard before, one for a relationship that may never have been what I remembered it as, while the person was still very much alive somewhere in the world. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, the single most important step is placing a fraud alert with the credit bureaus immediately, followed by a police report and an FTC identity theft affidavit, because those documents become the foundation for every dispute that follows, and waiting, out of hesitation or hope that there is some other explanation, only prolongs the damage. I did not file that report until nearly 3 weeks into my own process, delayed by my own reluctance to accept what was happening, and I believe that delay cost me additional complications I could have avoided with earlier action. Danielle was released after 14 months for good behavior, a reduction granted according to the notification I received as the registered victim in her case. She wrote to me once, 2 months later, forwarded through my attorney, apologizing more specifically than she ever had in court, naming my father's illness, my wedding, the birth of my children, and asking whether there might ever be room for some small, careful version of communication between us again. I have not answered that letter, and I am honestly not certain I ever will. My therapist has reminded me more than once that healing does not require either forgiveness or permanent estrangement, only honesty about what I am actually ready for, and I have slowly learned to sit with that uncertainty instead of forcing it toward a neat resolution it may never actually have. Some doors, once they close as completely as this one did, may simply need to stay closed for a while, regardless of how much history exists on the other side of them. I do not want this story to leave you believing every close friendship carries a hidden threat waiting to reveal itself eventually, because that has never been my genuine belief, even now. Most of the people I love have never given me a single reason to doubt them, and I refuse to let one profound betrayal convince me that trust itself was a mistake. What changed is my understanding that love and unquestioning access are not the same thing, and that I can offer someone my full heart without also handing over unsupervised entry into every corner of my life without any thoughtful boundary at all. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, watch for patterns rather than single moments. A question about your finances means nothing on its own. A pattern of similar questions, spread out over months so no single one feels alarming, is something else entirely. Growing vagueness about someone's own life during exactly the period they have the most to hide is another. I am not asking you to become suspicious of every friend who shows genuine interest in your life. I am asking you to trust your own instincts when something quietly, persistently does not add up, even when the person involved is someone you love and would never want to suspect of anything at all. The last time I saw Danielle in person was during that sentencing hearing. As the courtroom emptied afterward, she turned and looked at me for the first time since her arrest, only 10 or 15 seconds before the deputies led her out through a side door. I have tried many times to describe what I saw in her expression in that moment, and I am still not certain I can. It was not defiance, and it was not the composed blankness she had maintained through most of the proceedings. There was something that looked almost like genuine grief, though I recognize I will never be able to fully separate what I actually saw from what some small part of me still wanted to see. What this experience taught me, more than anything else, is that the people most capable of causing us the deepest harm are rarely strangers lurking in the shadows of our lives. They are the people we have already let all the way in, the ones who know exactly where we keep our most important documents and exactly which questions will make us doubt ourselves fastest. I do not say this to make you suspicious of everyone you love. I say it because real trust should be built on more than history and affection alone. It should be built on consistency between words and actions over time, and on the willingness, even when it feels disloyal, to pay attention when something quietly does not add up. My name is mine again now, fully and completely, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure it stays that way. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story, from that ordinary Tuesday morning phone call, all the way through a courtroom verdict, and everything that came after it. Stories like this are hard to tell, and I know they are hard to sit through as a viewer too, especially if any part of it reminded you of a relationship in your own life you have quietly questioned, but never fully examined. I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a betrayal from someone you trusted, as deeply as I trusted Danielle? Did you notice warning signs at the time, or did they only become clear looking backward the way mine did? I read every single comment, and I know so many of you carry stories just as difficult as this one, stories that deserve to be heard and understood, rather than carried alone in silence. Sharing this publicly was not an easy decision for me, but if it helps even one of you feel a little less alone in whatever version of this you may be carrying, it will have been worth every uncomfortable moment it took to tell it. Whatever chapter you may be living through right now, I believe, with everything I have learned, that the ending has not been written yet, and that the version of hope I eventually found is available to you too, whenever you are ready to reach for it. My story did not end in that courtroom, and it did not end with that final glance exchanged across an emptying room. It continues every day, in the quiet, ordinary choices I make to keep building a life that belongs fully and completely to me, shaped by what I survived, but never permanently defined by it. Thank you for being here for this one, all the way to the very last word.